Hello. Today I want to talk about a concept I have about psychology. This is a personal opinion of mine. Yeah, I've kind of had it as a sort of vague idea. I've written a couple notes about it, but I want to put it into words. So, there is this phenomenon, or not necessarily phenomenon, I'd say more. There's this quality of the human mind that I call the arbitrariness of affect. Now, what this is that, well, first I need to kind of establish what this means, right? So I need to say what the parts of this term mean. So, okay, what is affect? Affect is a term typically used in neuroscience that refers, like, in neuroscience, there are various, fields of study that relate to the mind. Like, you could study, say, cognition, which relates to such things as, like, mathematical ability, memory, what you might call things that relate to, like, you might say intelligence or, you know, comprehension. That's what you could say cognition is. And then you have this other, you could say that there's motor things. There's motor neuroscience, which relates to, stuff like reflexes and your ability to walk and like stuff like that. Now, one of these fields is called, there are multiple names for it, but it's called, one name is affect. And affect refers to such things as emotion, motivation, pleasure, pain, that kind of stuff. And so, when I say the arbitrariness of affect, you immediately know that what I'm saying relates to affect, right? So, what do I mean by saying that it's arbitrary? Okay. I believe that most people have a belief, and this is an implicit, you might even say subconscious belief. Most people have a belief that things that induce in them a particular emotion or feeling of pleasure, pain, or something like that, or just any sort of affective feeling, right? That those things, in a sense, have that, affect. I'm just going to call like all of these things affect. So when I say they have the affect, what I mean is that they might have pain, they might have pleasure, they might have emotion, they might have sadness, happiness, whatever, right? So people believe that it sort of subconsciously that, or they kind of, it's not like unconscious, it's sort of like just assumed. It's sort of like it's okay, it's something that's so universal that I don't even think it's in your average person, in their mind as a possibility. Okay, but what is this thing I'm talking about? Most people think that the affect of something is a part of that thing, such that, for example, when something is painful, or no, even the wording of it kind of implies that, no, when something induces pain in you, when something causes someone to feel pain, they think of it to where pain, like the pain is something on that object, a part of that object that they're sensing. So, for example, let's say you're looking at an object like a cube, right? You're looking at a cube, and you're looking at its qualities. You might say that, oh, this cube has it has a silver color to it. This cube has the shape of, well, a cube. This cube is heavy. It has a lot of mass. It's made of metal, right? You're observing aspects about the cube. And people, I think, intrinsically, inherently assume that when you talk about such things as like pleasure or pain or whatever, that they're a part of an object, such that, let's say you think the cube looks ugly, and, I'd say that finding something to look ugly is in itself sort of like a form of pain, so you'd say that the ugliness, well, ugliness in itself is an affect, even if it's not, a form of pain, but that's kind of irrelevant, but so the ugliness is also a part of the cube, just like the cube shape is a part of the cube, or the weight is a part of the cube, right? Like the pain is a part of the cube, and or like if something is painful, like the cutting of your arm, it's not just that, for example, sense, you sort of observe, like like you can observe through like touch, like you can touch something to tell its shape, like when you get cut you can observe that you're like getting cut, but then people assume that when you get cut, a part of cutting is painful, so you're sort of observing the pain of being cut, or when you observe something you find ugly, you're observing the ugliness of that thing, you know so I believe that that's, you know, how I would phrase this is that people believe that affect is cognitive in a way. Because I'd say that cognitive, like the concept of cognition fundamentally relates to the concept of perceiving things, you might say, or of comprehending things, of ascertaining their traits. Like when you're doing math, you're sort of like ascertaining like the values and quantities, you might say, of something. You're like thinking about, the various, numbers, and you're sort of thinking about how they relate to each other and like combined what they form, and that's cognition, like you're understanding the numbers when you do math, and when you're like doing when you're using memory, part of memory is that you're understanding, like you're remembering a fact, like you're remembering, something. So you could say that cognition is about, fundamentally about ascertaining the nature of things, about ascertaining objects, about understanding objects, you might say. And so people think that affect is cognitive, such that affect is something like the affectivity of a thing is something you ascertain. It's something that has, it has the affectivity, such that, for example, when something is, say, when something is pleasurable, it is pleasurable. It doesn't cause you pleasurable. Well, it technically does cause you pleasure, but what's kind of happening is that you're observing the pleasure. You're sort of observing the pleasure and feeling it, just as how you might observe the shape of a cube and sort of feel its shape. Or like when you observe any sort of shape, in a sense, you're kind of feeling in a way. And even like when you're, cognitively like understanding things, you're sort of in a, general way feeling them. Like when you do a mathematical calculation, you're kind of feeling the numbers, you're sensing the numbers, But I believe that affect is essentially, is that it's not cognitive completely. I don't believe that any part of affect, affect is cognitive. I don't believe that anything has any sort of cognition to it. So I don't believe, no, what I meant to say is that I don't believe that anything has any sort of affect to it, right? Okay. So, I've established I've established this distinction between affect as being cognitive and affect as being non-cognitive, right? So, when I say the arbitrariness of affect, what I'm essentially saying is that affect is not cognitive. So you can basically define the arbitrariness of affect as being the claim or the fact, or, the position, or as, the idea that affect is not cognitive. That when you observe, an object and feel a particular affective feeling from it, you're not, that you're not observing or sensing the affect of that object. You are simply just observing the object. And when I say object, I'm including such things as like other people and like abstract notions. When I say object, I'm using a very general term that might be more apt to be just called thing. Like, you, instead of saying object, just say thing. Like when you observe something, But when you observe something, I believe that what happens is that it's not that you observe the qualities of that thing when you feel an emotion from that thing. What's happening is that you observe that thing, and through internal mechanisms of yourself, of your mind, you might say, what these observing certain kind of things induces in you certain affects. So, for example, I don't believe that sunsets are beautiful in the sense that I don't believe that sunsets have this quality of beauty in themselves. Like, they aren't beautiful in the same way a sunset is, has a certain color, you might say, or has a certain like a shape, or has a certain place that it's located in. Sunsets don't have any sort of beauty to them. Well, they don't have any sort of ugliness to them either. And when I say this, I mean in like you might say an objective sense. Now, for me personally, I like the look of sunsets, but that's not relevant. I'm talking about a claim about the world here. So, sunsets aren't beautiful, but when most people, including me, see a sunset, what happens is that there's certain qualities that your brain, you know, responds to in certain, or not necessarily brain, that your mind responds to in certain ways, such that when you see things about a sunset, like the particular hues of color, the particular like shininess that typically accompanies a sunset, things like that, the sort of vastness of how sunsets typically look, how they span the entire sky, right? That kind of thing. Those qualities, which are qualities of the sunset, like the hue of the sunset is a quality of it, the area that it inhabits, like all around the sky, that's a quality of the sunset, right? These are all qualities that you cognitively sort of observe. But then because of this perception that you're having of the sunset, your mind works in a way such that it has a nature, it has certain sort of it has a nature to it. It has certain inbuilt, you know, you might almost say programmed, responses that it has to certain things. So when you see the things, the aspects of sunsets, the actual aspects of sunsets, not the affect of a sunset, which I don't think exists, but the affects, and not the affects, but the qualities of the sunset, your brain, you know, your brain just induces these at certain affects from the observation of these qualities in a causal sense, sort of like how a robot, like you could theoretically program, say, like a robot, like a sensor, not necessarily even a robot, just a sensor. You could program a sensor in such a way that it does certain things in response to certain signals. Like you could say that, oh, make this sensor, like you could program into a sensor whenever you detect this color of light. Say, I don't know, or like when you detect a lot of blue, open this door, or like when you detect a certain code, like a certain, what are those things called that are like on shopping, that are on like a groceries, barcodes. Like if you see a certain type of barcode, unlock a door. right? But you could do the exact opposite. You could say, okay, if you see this barcode, or if you see the presence of a person, oh no, here's a better example. You could program a sensor to see whenever it detects motion for it to open a door, sort of like, oh, I can just walk over to the sensor and it just automatically opens without me having to open the door. Like, oh, isn't that cool? People do that, and that's a very easy way. But you could also program a natural security system where you could have the exact same sensor, but design it in such a way to where you make it when it detects motion, instead of opening the door, shutting the door shut, just locking it. And that's kind of how I view how the human mind naturally works. It's programmed in a certain way, you might say, such that certain qualities, such as shininess, vastness, you know, a lot of colors, all over the place. That sort of stuff in the human mind induces beauty. Just as when a motion detector, detects motion, it responds in a certain way by opening a door, closing a door. Your brain, when it sees a certain sort of thing, like when it detects shininess, you might say, which is a quality of an object, it induces certain emotions, just as how when a motion detector detects something, it induces certain actions, such as shutting a door. Your brain induces, you know, the feeling of pleasure into it. It makes essentially your brain or your mind to generate pleasure. It makes it generate pleasure when you see these things. And that's the most fundamental, definite, that's like basically the core of what the arbitrariness of affect is. Now, what do I mean by arbitrariness? Well, it essentially says that that the affect you have towards something is not based in like the qualities of the external world, in the sense that when you like find a sunset beautiful, you're not like observing the qualities and then finding it beautiful. What's happening is that the internal standards of your mind, the internal mechanisms of your mind, just are constructed or are just configured in such a way that they make you find sunsets beautiful. So in that sense, it's arbitrary, So when I say affect is arbitrary, what I'm saying is that what you find beautiful is based on yourself. It's based on the internal mechanisms of your mind. It's not based on like some standard that exists in the world that you're sensing. Like, it's not that there's the beauty in the world that you observe. It's that your brain just, because of how it functions, just finds these things to be beautiful. And that's what I mean by arbitrariness. So yeah, that's essentially what it is, the arbitrariness of affect. So I think I've described it sufficiently. That's what the arbitrariness of affect is. Nothing more to say about that.